What happens when a man who grew up marginalized and displaced uses everything that rejection taught him to build the most formidable military force in the history of his region? In the early 19th century, a man who had been born outside the boundaries of social acceptance among the Ningi peoples of southern Africa transformed a small clan into a centralized kingdom whose military innovations reshaped the political map of an entire region. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
Shaka is one of those figures whose name has become inseparable from a particular image, the warrior king of legend, and recovering the historical person behind that image requires engaging seriously with what the evidence actually shows and what it does not. Tonight, we turn to a leader whose military and political innovations created the Zulu kingdom, and whose legacy shaped southern Africa for generations after his death. The question is not whether Shaka was a great military commander, but what his methods of transformation reveal about the relationship between personal experience, institutional innovation, and political power.
Shaka did not simply conquer neighboring peoples. He reorganized the fundamental social and military structures of the Zulu people, binding them into a centralized state through new institutions of loyalty, discipline, and collective identity that had no precedent in the region.
We are speaking about Shaka, founder of the Zulu kingdom and one of the most transformative military and political leaders in southern African history.
His reign lasted roughly 12 years. What he built in that time endured as a political force in southern Africa for decades after his death, and shaped the conditions under which the region encountered European colonial expansion.
Then let us begin with the world Shaka was born into, and the early experiences that formed him.
Shaka was born probably around 1787 or 1788, in what is now the KwaZulu-Natal region of South Africa. His father was Sensangakona, a minor chief of the Zulu clan, a relatively small group within the broader world of Guinea-speaking people. His mother was Nandi, a woman of the Langeni clan. Their union was irregular by the customs of the time, and was not socially sanctioned in the manner of a recognized marriage. Shaka and his mother were eventually expelled from the Zulu clan, and returned to the Langeni, where they were also treated as outsiders. These years of displacement and social rejection were formative. Later accounts, many of them drawing on oral tradition, describe a childhood marked by bullying and marginalization. Whether the details are precisely accurate or have been shaped by retrospective legend is difficult to determine. But the social reality of his irregular birth and uncertain status was real and consequential.
So the man who would create the most disciplined army in the region spent his formative years outside every community that should have claimed him.
Yes, and here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard account. Shaka is often presented as a self-made military genius who arose from nothing through pure force of will. In reality, the most important phase of his early development occurred within an existing and sophisticated political structure. As a young man, he entered the service of Dingiswayo, the chief of the Mthethwa Confederacy, one of the most powerful political alliances in the region. Dingiswayo had himself been exposed to European ideas about military organization and political consolidation through contact with traders and settlers at the Cape Colony. He had begun to reorganize his own military system along lines that emphasized larger, more disciplined formations over the traditional practice of cattle raiding by loosely organized groups. Shaka trained and served within this system, absorbing its lessons and developing his own ideas about how it could be extended and improved.
So his military thinking was shaped by an existing tradition of reform rather than invented from nothing.
Exactly. When Sengakona passed away around 1816, Shaka, with the backing of Dingiswayo, moved to secure leadership of the Zulu clan. He eliminated rivals and consolidated authority rapidly. After the death of Dingiswayo around 1817 or 18, Shaka was well positioned to absorb many of the Mthethwa's constituent groups into a new and expanding Zulu state. The military reforms Shaka introduced were systematic and comprehensive. He reorganized warriors into age-based regiments called Amabutho, in which men of similar age trained, lived, and fought together. This was not entirely new in the region, but Shaka extended and intensified the system, making the regiments the primary unit of social organization for young men, and subjecting them to a level of discipline and training that had no precedent in the area.
So the regiment became a total institution that replaced the clan as the primary source of identity and loyalty for young Zulu men.
Yes, and this was the political genius of the system, as much as its military genius. By organizing young men into regiments that owed loyalty directly to the king rather than to clan elders, Shaka simultaneously built a military force and restructured the social hierarchy of the Zulu state. The Amabuto were not allowed to marry until the king gave permission, which he withheld for many years. This kept large numbers of men bound to their regiments and dependent on royal favor. His tactical innovations complemented the institutional ones. He replaced the long throwing spear used in traditional Langini warfare with a shorter, broader stabbing spear called the Ikulwa, designed for close combat. He required warriors to carry a large cowhide shield, and developed fighting techniques that used the shield to hook an opponent's shield aside, exposing the body for a stabbing thrust. Warriors were trained to close distance rapidly and fight at close quarters rather than exchanging throwing weapons at a distance.
So he redesigned the entire logic of combat in the region, from distance exchange to close engagement.
Precisely. And the formation most associated with his tactical system is the one often called the horns of the buffalo. The chest, the main body of the formation, engaged the enemy frontally and fixed their attention and movement. The horns, two flanking columns, moved rapidly around the sides to encircle the enemy. A reserve called the loins was held back and turned away from the fighting to prevent them from becoming prematurely excited and breaking formation. The combination produced a decisive and relatively rapid engagement.
So the formation was designed to prevent escape and to produce a definitive outcome, rather than a prolonged exchange.
Yes, this is the turning point in understanding why Shaka's army was so effective against the military forces of neighboring peoples who had not adopted similar reforms. They were trained in older tactical patterns that assumed a different kind of engagement. When they encountered the Zulu system, the combination of close combat technique, disciplined formation, and encirclement created a decisive asymmetry. The broader regional consequences of Shaka's expansion form part of what historians have called the Mfecane, a term that refers to the widespread violence, displacement, and political reorganization that swept across southern Africa during the early 19th century. Communities that were defeated or threatened by Zulu expansion moved, sometimes displacing other communities in turn, creating a cascade of migrations and conflicts that reshaped political structures across a vast area.
So the transformation Shaka set in motion extended far beyond the borders of the Zulu kingdom itself.
Yes, though the Mfecane is itself a contested concept among historians, earlier scholarship attributed most of the regional disruption directly to Zulu expansion. More recent scholarship has argued that the causes were multiple, including the effects of drought, the disruption of trade networks connected to the slave trade operating from Portuguese-controlled ports on the Bees, Mozambican coast, and the pressure exerted by European settler expansion from the south. Shaka's campaigns were one major factor among several waves.
So the historical picture is more complex than the popular image of a single conqueror transforming an entire region.
Yes, and this complexity is important for understanding Shaka accurately. The Zulu kingdom was not the only new political formation to emerge in this period. The Sotho kingdom under Mushushu, the Swazi state, and several other polities also consolidated during the same decades, often in response to the pressures that Zulu expansion created. The regional transformation was multilateral, not the product of a single actor. Shaka's reign became increasingly intense in its demands on his people in its later years. The campaigns were continuous, the requirements for loyalty absolute, and the consequences of perceived disloyalty severe. His mother Nandi passed away in 1827, and the period of mourning he imposed on the kingdom was reported to have been extreme, with accounts of widespread hardship during an enforced period of national grief. Whether these accounts are fully accurate or have been amplified by later sources is debated. In September of 1828, Shaka was attacked and his life ended by his half-brothers Dingani and Mlangana, in alliance with his personal attendant Mupar. The conspiracy succeeded, and Dingane assumed leadership of the Zulu kingdom. The circumstances surrounding his end reflect the structural vulnerability of a centralized personal authority that depends entirely on the loyalty of those closest to power. The sources for Shaka's life present a specific challenge that is worth acknowledging directly. The earliest written accounts come from European traders, most notably Henry Francis Finn and Nathaniel Isaacs, who visited the Zulu kingdom during Shaka's reign and left detailed journals. These accounts contain valuable eyewitness observations but are also shaped by the assumptions, prejudices, and narrative conventions of early 19th century European writing about Africa. Isaacs in particular is known to have embellished and dramatized his account for a European audience, eager for stories of African savagery.
So the very sources that preserve the most detailed picture of his reign are also the ones most shaped by colonial perspective.
Yes, and this is why oral tradition is so important for recovering a more balanced account. The Zulu oral tradition preserves stories about Shaka that emphasized his organizational genius, his physical courage, and his political acuity, alongside accounts of his severity. These traditions were collected and recorded by later researchers, and provide a perspective on Shaka that is shaped by a different relationship to the subject than the European journals offer. The cattle economy of the Nguni peoples is essential context for understanding what Shaka's campaigns meant in practical terms. Cattle were the primary form of wealth, the medium through which marriages were arranged, alliances were sealed, and social status was expressed. Riding cattle from neighboring groups was a traditional form of both economic activity and political assertion. Shaka's military system converted this traditional practice into something qualitatively different, a mechanism for territorial incorporation and political centralization rather than episodic raiding.
So he transformed a distributed practice of competitive raiding into a centralized project of state building.
Precisely. And this transformation had consequences for every community in the region. Groups that had previously existed in a competitive but relatively stable equilibrium of raiding and counter-raiding found themselves facing a force that was not interested in taking cattle and leaving but in absorbing populations and territories into a new political order. The choice for many groups was incorporation or flight. The incorporation strategy Shaka used was in some respects as important as the military one. Defeated groups were not simply destroyed. Warriors from conquered peoples were absorbed into the Amabito system, given Zulu identity, and bound by the same obligations of loyalty and discipline that bound Zulu-born warriors. This meant the Zulu kingdom grew not only territorially, but in human capacity with each expansion, incorporating the military potential of the peoples it defeated, rather than merely eliminating them.
So the Amabito system was also an integration mechanism that transformed enemies into subjects.
Yes, and this is one of the reasons the kingdom grew as rapidly as it did. A purely destructive military policy would have created enemies and depopulated territory. The incorporation policy created a self-reinforcing cycle, in which each expansion added both territory and military capacity to the expanding state. This is a pattern visible in other rapidly expanding polities throughout history, but Shaka executed it with unusual consistency and speed.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, Marlas who want to understand both the man and the kingdom he built, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Shaka Zulu by E.A. Ritter.
So this is a book that combines historical sources with oral tradition to reconstruct the emergence of the Zulu state.
Ritter traces Shaka's early struggles, his military reform, and the creation of a disciplined warrior society that transformed regional power structures in southern Africa. The book draws on both written records and oral traditions to reconstruct the dramatic emergence of the Zulu state and the leadership style that made Shaka one of the most memorable figures in African history.
Is it accessible to readers without a prior background in Southern African history?
Ritter writes in a narrative style that is engaging and accessible. The book is not a dry academic text. It reads more like a historical narrative with strong biographical drive. A reader coming to the subject for the first time will find it compelling and informative, while remaining aware that some of its reconstructions depend on oral sources that require careful interpretation.
So it gives the reader the story and the world while being honest about the nature of the evidence.
Precisely. And for a figure like Shaka, whose life is known partly through oral tradition and partly through accounts written by European traders and missionaries who encountered the Zulu kingdom, the question of how to read the Zulu kingdom, the question of how to read the evidence is itself an important part of understanding the history.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The immediate legacy of Shaka's reign was a Zulu kingdom that survived his death and remained a major political force in southern Africa for decades. Under Dingana, Elinang, Zulu kingdom's encounter with British colonial expansion culminated in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of British imperial expansion. At the Battle of Isandlwana, a Zulu force, the Zulu army was ultimately defeated at Ulundi, but the capacity of the Zulu kingdom to mount that resistance was a direct consequence of the military and institutional structures Shaka had built 60 years earlier.
So, the institutions he created outlasted him by 2 generations, and were still capable of defeating a major European army.
Yes, and this is perhaps the clearest measure of the durability of what he built. Military and social institutions that can sustain themselves across multiple successions and continue to function effectively decades after their creator's death are rare in any historical context. The Zulu kingdom's performance in 1879 was a testament to the structural quality of Shaka's innovations. The complexity of his legacy has been subject to considerable revision over time. Early European accounts written by traders, missionaries, and colonial administrators tended to emphasize the violence and terror of his rule, constructing an image of a tyrannical despot that served colonial narratives about the need for European order in Africa. Later nationalist historiography in South Africa, particularly during and after the struggle against apartheid, tended to emphasize Shaka's role as a builder of African political power and a symbol of resistance.
So the image of Shaka has been shaped by political needs as much as by historical evidence.
Yes. And recovering a more accurate picture requires holding both dimensions in view. The violence of his campaigns and the severity of his rule were real. So was the political and military achievement of building a centralized state from a minor clan within a single generation. Both are part of the historical record, and neither cancels the other. His modern relevance is perhaps most visible in the questions his career raises about military and institutional innovation. Shaka worked within the resources and traditions available to him, and identified the points at which those traditions could be reformed to produce significantly greater effectiveness. The combination of tactical innovation, institutional restructuring, and political centralization he achieved is a pattern that appears in military history across many cultures and periods. What makes his case distinctive is the speed and the scale at which he accomplished it.
So the lesson from Shaka is not about a particular set of tactics, but about the relationship between innovation, institution building, and the transformation of power.
Precisely. He understood that tactical superiority alone does not create lasting power. What creates lasting power is the institutional framework that sustains tactical superiority across time. Through successions, through defeats, through the inevitable loss of the founding leader. The Amabutho system was not just a military organization. It was a social technology for binding loyalty to the state rather than to the clan, and that technology outlasted him. The parallel to his own early life is worth noting. A man who had been denied belonging to any community created institutions specifically designed to generate belonging, loyalty, and collective identity among men who owed their primary allegiance to the kingdom, rather than to their birth group. Whether this connection between personal experience and institutional design was conscious or not.
Zola's marginalization of his youth became the template for the loyalty system of his state.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most striking aspect of his story. The experience of being excluded from every community that should have claimed him gave him an understanding of what belonging meant and what its absence cost that he then used to build institutions of collective identity more powerful than anything that had existed in the region before him. The wound became the instrument.
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the early displacement, the military reforms, the Mfecane, and the institutions that outlasted Shaka by 2 generations.
Shaka reminds us that the most enduring forms of power are not built from strength alone, but from the capacity to transform personal experience into institutional design.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.